Hello to all of our friends watching. Thank you for joining us today for Love No Matter What with Rick Long, pastor of Grace Church in Arvada, Colorado. We are so excited to be with you for the next 30 minutes and hope this message is encouraging and impactful to
you. Because the reality is the world feels really big. The world feels really crazy and sometimes a little scary. But if we take the Bible seriously, we will see that it is ordinary people doing ordinary things who just go to God and say, hey, I still think that you can do something with one person's life. Those are the people who change everything. And so in this series, as we've talked about these big, larger-than-life heroes, I want you to recognize that none of them started that way. If we understand their lives, when we met them, they were just trying to live their normal, ordinary lives. But at some point or another, they said to God, hey, whatever you want to do with my life, I'm going to say yes. So I want you to take a look at this. Our legend of the call for week 9 is Hannah. Now, her occupation is sort of hard to define because she kind of did what every woman did at this point in history, but it would be weird to say her occupation was just woman. And so we're going to go with farm wife, okay? Because she was a woman who was kind of in charge of a household, and she probably, like most women at this point, worked sun up to sundown, walking maybe a couple of miles to the well to get water for the day for her family, and cooking and making clothing and working incredibly hard. Okay, she didn't officially have a job, but she was keeping people alive. But her place in life when we meet her is that she's in the midst of a long battle with infertility and loneliness. And this, at this point in history, is a huge deal, and it's a huge source of shame for her that she had gotten married and could not have children. And so much of a woman's identity at this point in history was wrapped up in her ability to have children. Some people even thought that that meant she had done something wrong. She had sinned. She was cursed by God because she couldn't have children. But her calling was to stand as a beacon of prayer in a time of chaos. To stand as a beacon of prayer in a time of chaos. Now, I don't know if you know anything about times of chaos, if you've ever lived through a time where things feel chaotic and rough in the world, sort of in general, but that's the kind of world that Hannah lived in. And so I want to talk a little bit about the world she came from. I want you to write these things down. This is what was going on around Hannah. See if you connect with any of this. First of all, Hannah's world was filled with immature and irresponsible leaders. Hannah's world was filled with immature and irresponsible leaders, kind of like my middle school. We had some teachers who were not really mature and responsible and helping us out, right? And so what you need to know about the world at this time, when Hannah was alive, we didn't have kings yet in Israel, and so the sort of leaders of everything were the priests, the spiritual leaders. These were men who were supposed to lead people to help them understand who God was and how to follow him. And the high priest at this point is a man named Eli. Now, Eli is getting old, and his two sons are getting sort of in training to be raised up to take over as the spiritual leaders. So if you can sort of picture this scenario, Eli is supposed to be training his sons to know the Lord and to lead the entire nation, spiritually speaking. But this is the comment in 1 Samuel about them. It says, the sons of Eli were worthless men. They did not know the Lord. Now, when your spiritual leaders don't even know the Lord, we have a problem, don't we? We have this immature and irresponsible leadership. In fact, these guys were stealing from people trying to get to God. They were manipulating their position as spiritual leaders to make themselves rich. That's what was going on. So ask yourself this: when have I been disappointed with someone who was supposed to lead me? When in my life have I been disappointed with someone who was supposed to lead me? Maybe you've had a boss or a teacher or a coach or even a church leader at some point in your life, and you're like, man, they were supposed to be the person I would count on. They were supposed to be the person that I was going to be able to lean on, and you found out the hard way that you couldn't trust that person. I want you to jot something down. Maybe it's a name or a memory that you just go, yeah, this was such a disappointing moment in my life because I was supposed to be able to trust my parents. I was supposed to be able to trust my pastors. I was supposed to be able to trust my teachers. I was supposed to be able to trust my coaches, and they let me down. But I want to tell you, too, that Hannah's world was filled with personal loneliness. Hannah lived an incredibly lonely life. In fact, there was something that happened relatively regularly back then. If you got married and your wife was not producing any children, it was not uncommon for a man to take on another wife because it was really important for him to have children to be able to sort of manage life and pass on his legacy. It wasn't a great idea, and I'm sure you can imagine what kind of families this produced. But it was not uncommon, and so this is what happens from everything we can tell in Hannah's life. It seems like she was probably the one that her husband Elkanah married first, and at first they were in love and they were young and everything was going to be great, and then year after year passed and she was not getting pregnant. And pretty soon he just said, you know what, we're going to find a different way to do this. And now when we meet her, Hannah's in a situation where this other wife that he has found has had children, and so he's sort of said to her, maybe not in so many words, but at least by his actions, hey, here's my family, and don't worry, I'm not going to cast you out. You're not going to starve. I'll keep feeding you, but you're sort of the extra here. See, in 1 Samuel 2, this is almost the very beginning of the book. It says Elkanah had two wives, Hannah and Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah did not. And so we're going to get the context of the situation where a lot of the action in this story is going to happen. It says each year, Elkanah would travel to Shiloh, that's where the tabernacle was, to worship and sacrifice the Lord at the tabernacle. On the days Elkanah presented his sacrifice, he would give portions of the meat to Peninnah and each of her children. And though he loved Hannah, he would give her only one choice portion because the Lord had given her no children. So Peninnah would taunt Hannah and make fun of her because the Lord had kept her from having children. Year after year, it was the same. Peninnah would taunt Hannah as they went to the tabernacle, and each time Hannah would be reduced to tears and would not even eat. See, this is a time of the year that's supposed to be this big celebration. It was the Passover. It was the biggest feast of the year. And what a lot of people don't understand about these sacrifices that the Old Testament talks about is that you would actually get the majority of the meat back. So when you would take your lamb or your bull or whatever and you would give it over to the priest at the tabernacle, they would butcher it and then they would use part of it for a sacrifice, but most of it would be given back to you. And so at these feasts was the best meal you had all year long, and it was this huge celebration. Because when you were generous to God, he was even more than generous back to you. And so Hannah would be with this family. And they lived about 14 miles from Shiloh. And so you remember this is a time before the, Model T. And so we have a family that is walking dusty roads, probably with a couple of donkeys and a couple of animals, and then Peninnah and her children, and Hannah sort of lagging behind doing her own thing. And for 14 miles, she would walk with this family and with her husband and with the other wife and all of her children. And then they would get to the tabernacle, and it would be this time that was supposed to be this huge celebration, and you can imagine what it felt like for her to be the last and the least. And to have her husband give her one little piece of meat and say, here you go, you're not going to starve, don't worry. We'll take care of you. To watch everyone else celebrate and feel like the extra. Maybe you've been in this situation. I mean, the loneliest times of all are the times you're actually surrounded by people. So ask yourself this, and maybe you jot something down. Where in my life do I feel alone? Where in my life do I feel alone? Because Hannah's life, it was a life of loneliness, surrounded by celebration year after year after year, but not participating in any of it. And then third, we see that Hannah's world was filled with silence from God. Hannah's world was filled with silence from God. Remember that prior to Hannah's life, we're in this period of the Judges where for about 400 years, nobody's really paying attention, and it's just getting worse and worse and worse and worse, and nobody really cares what God has to say, and nobody is really trying to hear from the Lord because they just want to live their own life their own way. And by the time we get to 1 Samuel 3, we have this sort of summary statement that says, "Now in those days, messages from the Lord were very rare, and visions were quite uncommon." It was not that God was unwilling to speak, it was just that no one cared to listen. So I want you to ask yourself, where in my life do I wish God would speak? Where am I feeling that deafening silence that I just wish I had some wisdom from God? Maybe you look at God and you go, "God, I just wish that you had some wisdom for me with my kids. God, I just wish you would help me at work to figure out how to get out of this situation that I'm in. God, I just wish you would give me some little bit of leverage in my finances, that you would help me to know how to get my budget under control. God, I just wish that you would help me understand how I could do better with my spouse or how I could get through to them. God, I just wish that you would give me some way, some information. Would you just say something?" That's where Hannah starts. She starts in a world where the sky feels dark and silent and God does not care. He's forgotten. And then finally, Hannah's world was filled with spiritual confusion. Filled with spiritual confusion. I told you the leaders really were not doing what they were supposed to do. And if we continue to follow this story, what we see is we see Hannah year after year after year going to the tabernacle with her family for Passover, and being the extra, being the other one, being so discouraged and depressed that she's not even eating. And if you picture this situation, this is a huge festival. And so there are hundreds, maybe thousands of families that are spread out all over the place. And it's this massive tent and this massive grounds where there are people who are giving their sacrifices, and then they're having these festive meals, and everyone's happy and everyone's excited. And it's the best time of year because we're remembering that at once we were slaves and now we're free and we get to follow the Lord. And Hannah is there watching her family celebrate, feeling like such an outsider. And finally, one year, it gets to be too much. And so you can picture this massive tent with all of these meals going on, and probably without anyone even noticing, at one point, Hannah just slips away. And she goes to the corner of a tent and just begins to pray. And this is where we pick up the story. It says, Hannah prayed silently to the Lord for a long time, but her lips were moving. And Eli, the priest that we talked about, this is how we know how terrible this guy was at his job. Eli, the priest, thought she was drunk. He says, "How long are you going to stay drunk? Sober up." And she's like interrupted out of her desperate prayer, wiping tears from her eyes, and goes, What are you talking about?" She says, "Sir, please don't think I'm no good. I'm not drunk. I haven't been drinking. Please, I feel miserable and terribly upset. I've been praying all this time, telling the Lord about my problems." Now, when your pastors can't recognize a woman desperately praying, but instead judge her and assume that she's drunk, we have an issue with leadership. And even after this, if you continue reading the story, she corrects him and says, no, I've been praying desperately to the Lord. And you'd think he'd be like, wow, finally someone. But instead he's like, oh, good luck with that. Kind of like high fives her and walks away. So it's this time where even the spiritual leaders around her are so confused about what God's doing. And so I want to ask you to consider this question. Where in my life am I confused about what God is doing? Where in your life does it feel foggy and muddy, where you look at your circumstances and you go, God, I don't understand. I don't feel like I could see it. I just wish I could have some clarity about what you want, about what's next, about what step to take. I just don't know. What is that situation where you feel that tension? Well, as we watch Hannah and her response in this, what I see is clarity. And so we can see 3 lessons from her that I really want you to wrestle with today. And the first one is this. I want you to write this down. I gain clarity in times of chaos when I ask God to show me what he wants most for my life. This is where it starts. When I ask God to show me what he wants most for my life. It's interesting how these times of chaos make us so afraid, don't they? I mean, I feel like everywhere we look right now, we see all the reasons why we're supposed to be scared. And fear, what it does is it makes us really selfish. It makes us self-protect. And it's so bizarre that we have been told for years now that we are a threat to each other because we're humans that breathe. Isn't that strange? It's a strange message. And I had a very weird experience a couple of weeks ago. I was at a store and, normally it's just sort of second nature. You see that someone's behind you and you hold the door, let them go through, and it's not a big deal. And you walk on and move on with your life. But this message that has been infused in us that getting close to each other means you're trying to murder someone is, it's a little intense. And so I was at this store and I see that this woman is behind me and I go to open the door and I'm about to step back to hold it for her and I realize she might actually be thinking that I'm trying to kill her. I don't know what she thinks about all this. And in order to get in the door, she's going to have to go pretty close to me. And I froze. It was such a weird thing. But fear has made it impossible to be kind to each other. And that's the kind of world Hannah lived in. A world completely paralyzed and selfish. And yet we have this woman who's willing to go to God and say, hey, I don't know what you want to do with me. I don't know what you could do with one life. But whatever I've got that you can use, you can have it. And so here's what happens. This is the prayer that Hannah was praying when she got interrupted by that lovely priest. It says, Hannah made this vow, O Lord of heaven's armies, if you will look upon my sorrow and answer my prayer and give me a son, then I will give him back to you. He will be yours for his entire lifetime, and as a sign that he has been dedicated to the Lord, his hair will never be cut. And sometimes we read this and we're like, she's making this bargain with God. She's trying to twist God's arm, and we think it's this selfish prayer. It's not a selfish prayer at all. She's giving this child back to God. She's not asking for anything for herself. In fact, I don't know if you know this. I don't know this from my own personal experience, but I hear pregnancy is hard. And especially back then, a lot of women died giving birth. But she goes to God and she says, God, if you can do something, even if it wrecks my body, I'm willing. And I don't think that she saw the whole big picture of everything we've been talking about, of this massive move from the judges into the time of David. I think she was just one person who was standing there saying, hey, all I've got is my life to offer you, but if you can do something with it, go ahead. I think that's what this prayer is. And there's this, really cool passage that Jesus gives us. It's a really vivid picture in Matthew 7 when he's talking about prayer and he's talking about the heart of God for us. He says, you parents, if your children ask for a loaf of bread, do you give them a stone instead? I mean, can you imagine that? A toddler walking up to mom, can I have a PB&J? Nope, but here's a rock. And the next one's even better. It says, if they ask for a fish, do you give them a snake? Mommy, I need mac and cheese. Nope, but here's a rattlesnake. Ha ha, we're going to the hospital today. This will be fun. That's not what parents do, right? No. It says, of course not. So if you sinful people know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your heavenly Father give good gifts to those who ask him? See, God really is a good dad. He knows what's best for you. But here's the problem. There's a flip side to this verse. See, a lot of us are mad at God because we're begging him for snakes and rocks, and he's saying no. We are desperately begging God to give us things that are going to destroy us. And I have to tell you guys that God will never help you sin. And God is really good, far better than you and I are, at knowing what's going to be good for you and what's going to destroy you. And yeah, there is a time eventually where God goes, okay, fine, have it your way, and he gets out of your way, but he's never going to help you sin. And sometimes the very best thing God can say to you is no. No, that's not good for you. And so what is our posture in prayer? How do we begin in prayer? We begin like Hannah began and we say, God, what do you want? Because we love the Santa Claus style prayer, don't we? Wake up in the morning, your feet hit the ground. Okay, God, here's my list. By the end of the day, I need a good cup of coffee, a Maserati, and a bigger house. Right? And we move on with our day and we get mad thinking God's not listening. Well, I have a challenge for you. I want you to pray like Hannah. For the next 30 days, my challenge for you is that you would start your prayer this way. God, what do you want for me today? Then secondly, I gain clarity in times of chaos when I give back to God whatever he gives me. When I give back to God whatever he gives me. So here's what happens. I'm sure you can imagine how this story goes. She goes home after this particular Passover, and she gets pregnant. God grants this prayer, and so she has the baby, and she tells Elkanah each year at Passover, I've got to at least get him to the point that he can survive on his own before I give him to the Lord. And so for 4 or 5 years, she has this precious time with her son. And she doesn't go to the tabernacle with him, but the time comes when she knows it's time. And guys, listen, if there is ever an example in the Bible of a person who trusts God, regardless of what kind of leadership she's under, this is it. Because think about where she's going and who she's giving her son to. The verse we're about to read is a conversation between her and Eli, that priest, who probably doesn't even remember her, who thought she was drunk when she was praying. That's the guy who's going to raise her son. But she brings him back and she goes to Eli and she says this. She says, I prayed for this child and the Lord has granted me what I asked of him. So now I give him, not to you, Eli, now I give him to the Lord. For his whole life he will be given over to the Lord, and he worshiped the Lord there. So God gives her this incredible gift of a child, and she says, okay, God, he's yours. So I want you to ask yourself this. What is the last thing God gave me? What is the last thing God gave me, and how will I give it back to him? It's funny, we had a couple here last night. Their baby is 10 days old. This is their first time back at church. And they caught me afterwards. They were like, I said, no, that's not. Please go pick up your children downstairs after church, okay? This was a one-time arrangement, and this is not the outcome we're looking for out of today. But ask yourself this, and maybe it is your kids. I mean, if you're a parent, realistically, this is probably the place you need to start with this, is to say to God, they're yours. I'm going to do my very best to raise them and influence them well, but like Samuel, they're yours. You're in charge of their life. And I'm not going to try so hard to protect them from every bad experience that they never learn the things that they need to learn. But maybe it's something else. Maybe it's a job that God has given you, and you need to spend some time going, God, what would it look like to go to work and spend that 8 or 10 hours every day honoring you and offering that to you? What would it look like to take the commute that you've given me, the 5 or 10 or 20 or 30 or 45 minutes or whatever it is, however long it takes you every day, what would it look like instead of seeing that as my time to say, God, this is yours? And to begin praying during that time to whoever or for whoever God brings to your mind, and to begin actually stopping when you see those people with signs and treating them like they're human beings, and maybe even planning ahead and having something valuable and worthwhile to give them. What would it look like for you to take your marriage or your home or your friendships or your money and to say, God, this is yours. I'm giving it back to you. Maybe that's a formal ceremony. We do a milestone journey with kids where you can talk to our pastors. You can talk to Jacob about what it looks like to actually formally dedicate your children to the Lord. We'd love to help you with that.
Hi, Love No Matter What family. Thank you for joining us and watching today's episode. I want to introduce you to a dear friend and my fellow elder, Pastor Jason Stockman.
Hi everyone, and I've been on staff here at Grace for almost 17 years. In addition to being an elder, my primary role is the pastor of music and worship. My family and I are passionate about this ministry, and we're so excited about what's on the horizon.
Yeah, and he loves the Lord, and he's amazing at worship. Matter of fact, we have an amazing project for our Grace Union worship team. You can go online and download those songs anytime. But I want to share about the project that's coming. You know, if you've been touched by this show, we want to invite you to participate with a very exciting addition. The addition is an expanded center that will bring hope to the community. It will expand our youth outreach with a 300-seat auditorium, plus allow for overflow on the weekends. We will add more space for our Celebrate Recovery, our Reach department, which is reaching the lost, equipping the next generation, assisting the poor, caring for the sick, and helping the hurting. And all of this, it expands the reach of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And I know you are committed to that. That's why you're part of our Love No Matter What family. So on behalf of Jason, myself, and our ministry, we'd like to invite you to visit our website and be a partner in this exciting journey, because it will allow us to reach out throughout the world. And if you're ever in Arvada, Colorado, you got to come by, because we consider you part of our Grace family. So on behalf of Jason, myself, and the team, we love you, God bless you, and may love no matter what carry you every day.